Hello, I'm Paul Brooks, the adult Sunday school teacher for the North Greensboro Church of God, and I'm here with this post to discuss this week's Sunday school lesson. This video is an aid for lesson number 12 as we near the end of our study of this unit, the Gospel by Mark. Today's lesson is titled, Jesus Stands Trial. Now, our lesson covers a very short period of time, just a matter of hours, covering Jesus' arrest, trials, and leading up to the crucifixion. We know that many had already rejected him. Now he's betrayed by one of his own disciples, forsook by the remaining disciples, denied by Peter, and wrongfully accused by the Jews in a successful attempt to have him killed. We have often studied the physical suffering of Jesus on the cross, but in this lesson, we see the mental pain that he must have suffered to provide our salvation. The central truth this week is that Jesus displayed humility in the darkest hours of his life. Our focus should be to observe Jesus' attitude while he was on trial and emulate his character. The emphasis for modern Christians this week is that Christ-like responses during difficult times may draw unbelievers to Christ. In all of the situations of his last hours, Jesus continued to demonstrate humility and even compassion for all those who turned against him. The lesson again is in our standard 3 parts. Part 1 is Jesus' betrayal and arrest. Part 2 is Jesus standing before the high priest. Part 3 is Jesus standing before Pilate. Today's lesson begins in a beautiful setting. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, the name Gethsemane, meaning oil press, suggests that the Garden of Gethsemane was a grove of olive trees in which was located an oil press. The garden is situated near the Mount of Olives, directly across the Kidron Valley from the walled city of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. The garden was a frequent place of retreat for Jesus and his disciples. On the night being studied, it would become a place of deepest sorrow. In part 1, we read in Mark chapter 14, verses 43 to 52, that Jesus was betrayed and arrested. In the first passage from chapter 14, verse 43 to 45, we read of Judas's betrayal. Although not a surprise to Jesus, it was likely still very hurtful that one of his 12 would betray him. Judas led a ragtag militia to the garden in the middle of the night, and then he identified Jesus with a kiss of betrayal. In the next passage from chapter 14, verse 46 to 52, we see the scene and events of the arrest. Although it was well within his power to avoid it, Jesus voluntarily submitted to his arrest. He knew this was all part of the redemptive plan. The events of the night and next day were necessary, but must have still been so hurtful to him. In verse 47, we read that one of Jesus' followers, identified as Peter in the Gospel by John, cut off an ear of one of the servants of the high priest. Jesus demonstrated compassion by preventing the killing of this person and healing his injury on the spot. Jesus did call the mob out in verses 48 to 49. There had been plenty of opportunities to arrest Jesus in the daylight and in the eyes of the public, but they came in the dark and out of sight of the public to do it. And Jesus knew this was all part of the necessary plan as well. At his arrest, all of his friends and followers finally fled the scene, forsaking him, leaving him alone. A surprising feature of the ministry of Jesus is its length. The Buddha taught for almost 50 years, Muhammad for about 20 years, and Moses led Israel for 40 years. Jesus, however, ended his mission after just 3 years. According to New Testament scholar Marcus J. Borg, Jesus' ministry was brief, a light flashing momentarily but brilliantly like a meteor in the night sky. And that's from Borg's book, Jesus, A New Vision. Instead, the focus of Jesus' life and ministry was his death and resurrection, which accomplished what his teaching ministry had not, the salvation of the world. Then, in part 2, we study about Jesus being brought before the high priest. In chapter 14, verses 53 to 59, we read about the false witnesses. No real witnesses to any wrongdoing or breaking of the Mosaic law could be found. So false or paid witnesses were brought forward, but their testimonies, being lies, did not agree. In verses 66 to 72, we also read of Peter's denials. In chapter 14, verses 60 to 62, we read from Jesus' interrogation before the high priest and the council. Jesus has been humble and maintaining his silence during his interrogation. Now in verse 62, he reveals his identity and more. In verse 62, and Jesus said, I am, and ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. So Jesus reveals his identity, but then makes clear that he will return and that he will set in judgment of the high priest and his council for what they are doing. But the high priest was not listening to Jesus' message, only to his words. He was looking for something to justify their plan of murder, and now he felt he had it. Jesus claimed to be the Messiah. In part 3, we read the events as Jesus appears before Pilate. In chapter 15, verses 1 to 5, we see Jesus' marvelous resolve. Jesus continues to fulfill the prophecies with his demeanor, his resolve, maintaining his silence throughout the trumped-up trials. The high priest and council felt their plan was almost complete, but they did not have the authority to put someone to death. That could only be done by Roman authority. So they bound Jesus and took him before Pilate, the Roman governor. Pilate questioned Jesus, but Jesus did not drop his demeanor, and Pilate himself marveled at him. Pilate could not find fault in Jesus and tried to offer compromises with the council, but they would have none of it. They wanted Jesus dead. The only accusation for which Jesus was actually guilty was the one which the high priest and council did not really believe, that Jesus was the King of the Jews, the Messiah, the Son of God. In the face of persecution, trials, difficulties, even death, Jesus refused to deny who he was. In Mark 15, verses 6 to 11, we read about the prisoner Barabbas. It was a Roman practice to release a political prisoner during Passover week. So Pilate, sure that the Jews would pick Jesus over a confirmed murderer, gave the Jewish crowd the choice. And we know the story. They picked Barabbas. In Mark chapter 15, verses 12 to 15, we read about Pilate's spineless decision. Even after the crowd chose Barabbas over Jesus, Pilate still had reservations and held off for a short while in sentencing Jesus, hoping that the Jews would change their minds. It was not to be. Finally, Pilate gave in and rendered the decision that the Jews wanted. hoping that this would calm and appease them for a while. Pilate not only wanted to gratify the crowd, but he also feared the threats of the Jews to report Pilate to Caesar for his behavior. So when he finally made his decision, it was especially cruel. Jesus was to be scourged and crucified. The trials, sentence, and crucifixion were carried out in less than 24 hours after his arrest. But we know the rest of that story. Jesus was not only on trial because of false accusations, but his character was on trial as well. Jesus maintained his demeanor and sense of humility throughout. He did not lash out at his persecutors as well he could have, but he remained truthful throughout as well. He never backed away from acknowledging his true identity. He was and is the Son of God. Let's end this lesson with the core takeaway. Always consider our response to persecution and trials in light of the example given for us by Jesus Christ himself. Do not deny the truth. How will we respond when questioned about Christ? Remember that Jesus made clear he was the master, but also the servant. How will we respond when given an opportunity to serve others? Will we seek out these opportunities? Finally, never let our egos get in the way of leading a Christ-like life. Will we respond by following Jesus' example of humility and service? Watching for several video posts next week as we wrap up our Sunday school study of the Gospel by Mark. Our next lesson is titled Jesus' Death and Resurrection. We will focus on the central truth that Jesus is alive. Thanks for joining me in this video, and as always, I pray that God will bless you while keeping you and your loved ones safe.